Nonprofits might not be owned by shareholders, but they have to operate like a business. It's one of my favorite common misconceptions about nonprofits, and we get this question all the time. Well, don't we have to zero out at the end of the year? Isn't that what nonprofit means? And I end up having to say nothing could be further from the truth. You don't want to zero out at the end of the year. Do you get that question too?
Yeah, that question does come up some. And like, I also sit on the board for a foundation for a university here in South Carolina. And one of the things that, we often talk about that is just like, hey, we do have to have some rigor and operate and some fiscal responsibility and actually make some smart decisions, because it's not, hey, spend all the money by the end of the year. Like, that's not in our best interest.
You're listening to the Nonprofit Council Podcast with host May Harris.
Well, good afternoon, Terell. Welcome to the Nonprofit Council Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you join us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So maybe we can start by you telling us a little bit about what you do and what your experience in the financial realm is.
Absolutely. So I guess you would say by title, I'm a bookkeeper and fractional CFO. And what that really means is we help, for-profit and some nonprofit organizations get organized when it comes down to their finances, so they can figure out where their money is going, where it's coming from. And then they can actually look at that to say, how do we make better decisions moving forward? And so that's pretty much what we do.
Right. And that's equally important for businesses and nonprofits. Nonprofits might not be owned by shareholders, but they have to operate like a business. It's one of my favorite common misconceptions about nonprofits, and we get this question all the time. Well, don't we have to zero out at the end of the year? Isn't that what nonprofit means? And I end up having to say nothing could be further from the truth. You don't want to zero out at the end of the year. Do you get that question too?
Yeah, that question does come up some. And like, I also sit on the board for a foundation for a university here in South Carolina. And one of the things that, we often talk about that is just like, hey, we do have to have some rigor and operate and some fiscal responsibility and actually make some smart decisions, because it's not, hey, spend all the money by the end of the year. Like, that's not in our best interest.
Right. So that's when, typically you'll lead into the nest egg discussion. And then a couple of years later, you'll lead into the endowment discussion, as a nonprofit grows and goes through the maturity cycle. But what are some of the other questions that you get from nonprofit organizations and as pertains to their financials?
Yeah, I think the first one, this is probably the most frequent one, is, do I need to keep track of this? Because I don't have to file a tax return. Like, we're not paying taxes. So do I even need to, track this information? And my first answer is, even if you don't have to file a tax return, you still want to know, like, how are you going to make, smart decisions if you don't actually keep track of this? And then I think another question that I get a lot is, where people hear about, the Form 990s is like, what is that? Or, how do you go about filing the 990s?
Right. So those are the informational tax returns, right, that nonprofit organizations do have to file. Right.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I usually tell people is that, that's a formality that is great, because you don't want to miss that filing, because it could impact your status as a non-for-profit organization, which then impacts, people's interest in wanting to donate to you. And like, you don't want to lose, that because you just didn't do this, this step of filing this form.
Right.
And so I do think the next question I usually get from a lot of people is more of, it's around kind of controls of how do you set up, like proper controls over the money? Like, how do we set up levels of authority and stuff, or like who can approve what? Because there have been some nonprofit organizations that they tend to kind of operate like the Wild Wild West, to use that terminology. I mean, it's where well, this person wants to do this, so they go out and do it. And I think that's where we have to take a step back and say, it's like, if you're a nonprofit, you have to have almost more accountability than a for-profit company. So you really need to make sure we focus on accountability.
I couldn't agree more. I think, I can't remember what CLE program, continuing legal education program I attended, but the incidence of embezzlement in nonprofit organizations is greater than other businesses. It's just, you're typically dealing with volunteers, especially the small to medium size, and you haven't put those financial controls into place. And so it's very easy for someone who feels that they need the money desperately to kind of take advantage of that without controls being put in place. So what are those primary controls that you recommend to your clients?
Yeah, the first one I would say is you do want to have some type of accounting system. It often amazes me how many, nonprofit organizations, they're just operating off a bank account. They're like, hey, if there's a positive number in there, then we're good. It's like, no,
right.
We need to get some kind of accountability around this. I mean, and I think that's probably the basic one is let's get an accounting system. I think the second one is then we actually have to have a bookkeeping process. Whether you actually hire a bookkeeper or you do it in-house, there has to be some process where someone is going through, looking at the transactions, looking at the money that came in, the money that went out, and being able to reconcile it back to the bank statements. Because that's where you start to find out, like, hey, is there anything missing in this gap? Like,
right.
Was money that was supposed to come in, somehow it went somewhere else? Like, where did it go?
Right. So that's one of the things I always recommend is the person who is making the deposits or processing payments should not be the same person who's reconciling the account, because it might show up there, but you might not notice it if it's the same person. And so, for these small organizations, sometimes that's difficult. And that's one reason maybe you have an outside bookkeeper doing that reconciliation. Then it's a little bit easier to identify if there has been, a lapse in control or a lapse in financial, the deposits, the amounts of money that are going in or out of the organization.
Absolutely. And I always tell, different nonprofit organizations, because sometimes, budgets can be tight about whether or not that they can afford to hire someone, depending on where they are in their life cycle, I would tell them maybe you don't hire that person on a monthly basis. Maybe you have them come in and do a quarterly assessment to where they can give you a second set of eyes on things, because all of the people in your organization, if they know that, hey, a third party is going to come in and look at this on a quarterly basis, it does kind of provide some control. Now, they may catch issues after the fact, but, at least you'll have some level of third party eyes and control around how the money is moving in and through your organization.
Right. And it's not going to be one of those year-long, multi-year embezzlement problems that we sometimes get, actually. So I think that's a great suggestion. It doesn't have to be, it definitely doesn't have to be someone who's in-house, and it doesn't have to be a monthly big one if you're a little guy. I think you kind of touched on this before. Some organizations don't have to fill out a big tax return. So there's 3 versions of the 990, right? So there's the full 990 with all the schedules that come with it. Then there's kind of a middle one for organizations that are greater than 50,000 and up to 200,000. They can do the 990 EZ. But then there's this e-postcard little thing that's for organizations under 50,000. And for that return, you don't even have to put a number in there. So are you under penalty of perjury? Are you usually less than 50,000? Yes. And so those are the organizations that tend to think that their financial statements, quote unquote, are their bank statements. So we assist with that a lot. It's like, no, these are statements. Yes, but they are not your financial statements. So the 2 financial statements that I typically recommend at minimum that organizations should review, hopefully on a monthly basis, but minimum on a quarterly basis, are, in business speak, it's a P&L. In nonprofit speak, it's statement of activity. And then a balance sheet, which in nonprofit speak is statement of financial position. Are there any others that you typically recommend?
Yeah, I would say as you start to grow and you start to see a lot more cash movement through your organization, is I would say a cash flow statement becomes very useful, because I think where your balance sheet or your statement of financial positions is going to tell you is, something like, what was your cash as of a specific date? But what the cash flow statement kind of tells you is, how did cash move through your business? Because I think that one becomes a good one to help you start looking kind of forward of like, hey, how do we start planning and anticipating things? Because, we don't want to be in a situation where we, let's say, we're a nonprofit organization and we're giving out grants, or we're, helping, people in need in a community, but we make more commitments than we actually have access to cash to. And so sometimes you got to look at that timing and make sure that, hey, we can kind of plan looking ahead.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's the next one in line. And then budget. I typically think it's the next one. So once you've started, evaluating that, then and you're strategically thinking of next year and the year after, then it's time to kind of tackle a budget, which I think is sometimes a little bit of a challenge for nonprofit organizations.
Absolutely. And also, I think that this one becomes a very helpful control over the money, because when you set out a budget that way, each month, when you look at, okay, what did we actually do? Well, if you compare it back to your budget and something looks very different from how you budgeted, then it becomes your first opportunity to ask questions like, hey, what's going on here? Like, we only planned to spend X amount of dollars here, but we spent way more than that. And that way it gives you an opportunity to start asking questions, because I tell people it's very difficult for you to manage, to know if you're managing the money, the financial side of the organization well, if you have nothing to compare it to. And I think the budget gives you kind of that, at least something to compare it to. And I agree. Early on, the budgeting process can be very complex because you don't know what to expect. Now, of course, as you get bigger and you have more history behind you, it becomes a little bit more predictable. So I do think early on, it does take some involvement of thinking about what is it that we plan on doing, and then how do we start to put numbers to those plans, so we have something to like hold ourselves accountable to.
Right. Well, I'm going to take you back to a nonprofit just starting out. So we've talked a little bit about the ideal things that they'll need to keep in mind as they grow. But when they're first setting up their accounting system, so we use QuickBooks. I'm sure a lot of people use QuickBooks. There are some challengers out there. I think Bench does accounting systems, et cetera. But we use QuickBooks for most of our clients. One thing that is an initial obstacle that I've found is setting up a chart of accounts that is appropriate for a nonprofit organization. It is not the same as a for-profit business. So, I do a lot of tax prep work for our clients, and it's pretty funny when I get a new financial statement that has, owner equity in there for a nonprofit. But that's just because they used a standard chart of accounts in QuickBooks. So what would you recommend to your clients when setting up, their first initial QuickBooks or other accounting software system? What kind of chart of accounts would you recommend?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say is, when you're setting up your QuickBooks, it's going to ask you like what type of, organization or a type of, business or that you have. And you can pick a nonprofit organization, like one of those categories. And because I think what that's going to do is it's going to start giving, QuickBooks program some, information about you, so it can start making different types of recommendations. Because if you just pick a for-profit business, you're going to get all recommendations that are geared toward for-profit businesses. So I would say start there because the AI that they programmed in there will help some. But once you get to the details of like your chart of accounts is, I always tell them to look at things, if we start from the statement of activities, is how will money be coming into your organization? Is it going to be individual donors? Is it going to be grants? Are there going to be, third-party organizations? And are they going to be really big third-party organizations that are giving you large lump sums of money? And those are, the categories you can kind of use for, let's say, the income or the revenue side of your nonprofit, because you want to use account descriptions and names that actually mean something to your organization and how you operate. And then when you start looking at some of your expenses, you do want to look at what types of things are we going to spend money on? Like, whether it's staffing or whether it's contractors or whether it's, kind of computer software, office supplies. When you start looking at those things, you do want to maybe tweak some of those names to be, kind of major categories of areas where you might spend money on. And then I would say once we jump over to things like the balance sheet, of course, you want to have cash. That's going to be a very important one for you. And then also you want to think about, on your liability side, if you're going to have, let's say, issue, if you're early on, you probably won't have a ton of debt categories. Maybe you have a credit card that you want to consider there. And then when you get into what would, on the business side, would normally be an equity, a lot of times for nonprofits, I see it listed as like net assets, which is just your assets of the organization minus the liabilities. And this is the residual value that's left after that math equation. And so those would be some of the upfront recommendations I would give.
Right. I couldn't say it better for a startup organization. That's exactly what you need to kind of think when you're setting it up. And then as you grow, typically at least in my experience, in the statement of activity side, you're going to have to differentiate between restricted and unrestricted. And so if you are accepting contributions and donations from private foundations, individual donors, and they might have a restriction on it, well, that's really important to notate in your bookkeeping program because you have to report that out on your 990. The other thing is when you get bigger, so you're now doing a full 990, so over 200,000 in revenue a year, you have to do something called the statement of functional expenses on that 990, right? So you have to characterize whether it's program, it's fundraising, or it's operational, management. And so if you set up your chart of accounts appropriately at the beginning, as you grow, when you hit that threshold, you'll be way ahead of the game.
Absolutely. And also, I would tell the people that as you grow to consider that about some of the sources of funding that you receive, because sometimes the source of funding may have different reporting requirements that you have to comply with. And sometimes you want to build that into your chart of accounts of maybe even having like a separate class code of like, hey, all of the money we got from this major donor, they want to know what specific expenses were related to this program. And you do want to say, as you grow, is what type of separation do we need to create within the chart of accounts so we can comply? Because that may be the difference between you being able to qualify for that grant or that funding the next time around if you have that clarity in your reporting.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, so you are the founder and I don't know what your other title is, but you have Terell Turner Group, which I think it's you and your lovely wife, if I recall correctly. So tell me a little bit about that website and your business and your two podcasts. You do two different podcasts, I believe.
Yeah, so you're correct. A firm that my wife and I started, both of us have an accounting and finance background. Both of us are CPAs, spend a lot of time in corporate finance and really spending a lot more time of looking at financial information and trying to translate it into, okay, what does this mean for the decision makers? Like people who look at this information that have to actually go take some action. What should this information be telling them? And since we spent a lot of time there and realized that not a lot of accountants tend to gravitate to I guess you say, the decision-making power of the data. So we decided to really lean into that. And that's kind of how we got into doing podcasts, as well as creating resources on our website of just taking common questions that, nonprofit organizations or for-profit, or sometimes just friends would ask us because of something they saw in the news, of just taking those questions and saying, how do we use the financial information to provide them with some insight? And we started creating videos, podcasts, as well as now we're creating more checklists on our website that, hey, if you have a question, we're trying to turn it into a checklist that'll give you kind of a easy to follow way to getting to, hey, what could be a good answer for you when it comes to that question.
So you have one of your podcasts is, I think it's Stuff Your Accountant Isn't Telling You. So what kind of things and topics do you cover in that podcast?
Yeah, so I think this was my wife's idea, a fun segment that she likes to do, and she calls it the tax tea. And usually it's at the end of every episode where what we do is we go through the irs.gov website, and there's a page where they list all of their enforcements. And literally every day there are, anywhere from 4 to 6 people who are being sentenced to prison for some tax fraud or tax related issue. And she'll pick one story and we'll just talk through the story of what happened. And then, hey, here are the red flags on how you can avoid this from becoming, your issue in your organization or in your life. And then I would say outside of the tax tea, a lot of times we'll talk about things like, if you're trying to, manage your cash flow, we'll explain what cash flow is. What are some good recommendations of things that you can do to make sure that your business has cash when you need the cash? Because if you don't get the timing right, you could significantly damage your organization.
That's an excellent point. So I love pointing out awesome resources on, websites like yours. You have one that is, Can You Afford to Hire? And I think that is applicable to businesses and nonprofits. So maybe you can go into what went into that resource and what you recommend.
Yeah. So after talking to several different business that were trying to figure out, hey, we need to expand. And even when talking to nonprofit organizations where they're saying like, we have all these different things that we want to do, but we don't have the resources to get it done. And so one of the things that I was thinking is like, how do you come up with something to help people understand, like, can you afford to hire? Because no matter what type of organization you have, at some point, you're going to reach your capacity of the amount of work that you can get done. And so what the tool would do is, or the resource would do is to help you start thinking about, some of those questions. Because what I was seeing a lot of people do is they got to their capacity and they just made a decision to go hire someone. And I would ask the question is, can you even afford this? And a lot of them would find out on the back end, because then they would have to go get like these short-term loans to try to make payroll. And they're in this constant cycle of taking out more debt to try to just keep afloat. And it's like, hey, we probably should do some type of assessment up front to figure out, can you afford to hire the people that you need? And what I always tell people is, even if the answer is no, that is good, because it lets us know like, hey, now let's create a plan on how we can get there. And I think that if people don't ask that question up front, they're just guessing and they're just making a decision, and they could be hurting themselves financially. So we decided, like, how do we create a resource to help people walk through some of those critical questions and to do some basic math on it to figure out like, hey, can I actually afford to hire? If the answer is yes, then okay, let's move forward with your hiring decision. If the answer is no, then hey, let's find some alternatives to maybe leveraging, technology to kind of speed up some things or take some things off your plate. Or let's just set a target on, we are going to hire, but here's where we need our revenue at, or our donations or our income as an organization to be able to sustain that new hire.
Right. And so you mentioned, coming down to a yes or no answer. And if no, then make a plan to get there. And most nonprofits, at least 501c3s, there are some things you can do and things you shouldn't do. The things you can do, you can have volunteers. You're the one entity type that can legally have volunteers doing what employees do and not have to pay them. So that's statutory. So that's great. So maybe part of the plan, if you can't afford to hire someone to run your program now, is utilize volunteers until you can hire someone to take responsibility. The one thing that I see some nonprofits it's a trap falling into is, well, we can't really afford to hire an employee because we can't afford payroll taxes, but we could afford just to send them a check as a 1099. So let's just do that. But that's a trap for the unwary. The IRS doesn't like that. They like appropriate worker classification. And if you are in California, they really like appropriate worker classification. So even though it might be cheaper for a nonprofit to make that decision, it's not wise under the terms of the IRS or charity regulators. You laugh. You've heard this before.
Yeah, I unfortunately, I hear that often. And I did a video once about bad advice that I hear on social media. And I've heard people give that advice often of well, we can't afford the payroll tax, so we'll just hire them as a contractor. And it's well, the IRS actually has some definition and language about who is a contractor. It's that's not a decision that we just get to make.
No.
There are some criteria and things that you want to keep in mind. And there are some people that have done it improperly, and now they have to go back and pay what they should have paid, plus penalties and late fees. And I'm that just will become a distraction for you to try to save a few dollars if you do it wrong. So right. I think it is best to sit back and really get wise counsel about how to approach that. And even as you were saying earlier, it's, that's where we do have to be, we have to think outside the box of just, if I need more people in my organization, but I can't afford it, it's saying, okay, all right, well, what could you afford? Maybe you hire that person part-time, or maybe we reorganize some of the other responsibilities that a volunteer could do so we can free up our existing staff to do other things. And then also, I think ultimately just setting a plan of what would you need to do to be able to afford to hire that person properly and to compensate them for what you need them to do. And I think if you start thinking more like that, I think you will allow your organization to grow, and you'll be able to, avoid the distractions of having to deal with, IRS penalties because you did something wrong to save a few dollars.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better. Okay, one of the other resources you have on your website is Signs of a Good Accountant. Now, if we just put a little nonprofit in there, what do you think are signs of a good nonprofit accountant?
I think the first one is, do they actually understand nonprofit accounting? That one, it sounds like a very obvious one, but it's so often that, I have to remind people is not all accountants are created equal. I mean, and even if you're talking to a CPA, not all CPAs do the same thing. And it's one of those things that as an accountant, I wish that accountants would have done a better job, similar to the legal profession, where, within the legal profession, it is much clearer that you have different types of lawyers. In the accounting profession, if you're a CPA, you're a CPA, and everybody assumes you do whatever they need your help with. They assume you do it. And that's just not the case. So I think the first one is, do they really understand, your type nonprofit accounting? And I think the next one is, do they understand your organization? And that one you kind of learn by just having conversations with them, because if you have a nonprofit organization and there are some things that are unique to the way that you operate, but if that accountant can never wrap their mind around that, then they're probably not going to be the best partner in providing you with the insight that you need from the numbers, because they're just not going to be able to think in the right frame of mind to be the most helpful to you. Now, they may understand nonprofit accounting and they may be able to do all the technical steps, but you're not going to be able to rely on them for insight that they can gain from them being that deep into the numbers. And then the next one I would say is it's more around an accountability thing. Is you want someone that will, set deadlines for you as far as, hey, here is when I will communicate financial information to you. And do they actually meet those deadlines? Because that is one of probably the most common complaints that I hear from nonprofit, for-profit organizations, is that I have an accountant, but they never meet my deadlines, or I don't know what's going on with our numbers, or I have no idea where we are, because when I reach out to them, they're always so busy. I can't get in touch with them. So you want someone who is going to be accountable to act like a part of your team, to deliver what they are expected to deliver and to deliver it when they are expected to deliver. Because if you can't get that from them, then I would say is you may be paying someone to do some technical work, but if that technical work isn't helping you make good decisions and helping you stay informed about your organization, it might not be the most helpful for you.
Right. So we typically recommend receiving financial statements for the previous month by the middle of the next month. It shouldn't be much later than that unless there's something really odd going on. And that really is to enable the nonprofit to make those good decisions that you've spoken about. Like if you don't have solid closed financial statements, either to provide to your C-suite if you're lucky enough to have one, or to your board if you're not, then how are they supposed to make good financial decisions or really, fulfill their fiduciary duties to the organization? So that's a really good point. A good nonprofit accountant or bookkeeping service is going to be responsive and produce things when they're supposed to.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on the Nonprofit Council podcast, Terell. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Nonprofit Council podcast. Are you ready to lead with clarity and confidence? Head to nonprofitcouncil.com to find the tools you need to start smart, lead strong, and create lasting impact.